I'm Leanne, I'm Christie, and you're in my studio. I'll be doing the demonstration for you today, looking at using suggestive brush strokes to build up a painting as though it were a tapestry. When you're using your brush to be suggestive and not to actually draw on the canvas, what you're essentially doing is allowing the brush to do the work. And by allowing the brush to do the work, you leave this little gap between of information between what the brush has done and what the viewer understands. And you don't need to fill in that entire gap. And I think that's an area where a lot of us tend to get stuck, is we think we need to almost draw with the paint, color in with the paint, and then we over explain. And in over explaining, we essentially remove all life from the painting and reduce the viewer just to being exactly that, a viewer and not a participant in the painting. So what we're looking to do with our paintings is to use brushstroke that is very suggestive, but we're building up the tapestry enough so that we don't leave the painting in abstraction. It does have a sense of representation to it. Of course, you can always pull back at any point and go more abstract or more representational, depending on how long you want that tapestry to go. But that's what we're looking at today. I've got a 10-inch by 10-inch canvas, and we'll be working on a scene with cyclists in Chinatown. The way that we're approaching, as I've mentioned, is with suggestive brushstrokes. So what we're relying on is for the paint, through the work that is put into the brush, to simply suggest a lot of the stuff. And in simply suggesting a lot of the stuff, we're allowing the viewer to use their life experiences to fill in the gaps. If we're successful, it should come across as being quite a representational image. You should be able to get a lot of this information across to the viewer. And obviously, in thinking about what you want to get across to the viewer, you want to be distilling down the important stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in this image that is very much background detail. The lines of the wires, the structures of the buildings, the windows, these are all background details that help us with context. But the actual subject of this painting is not that itself. The actual subject of the painting are these two cyclists. So when I'm dealing with the painting, yes, I want to have suggestive brushstrokes building up the cyclists, but also I don't want too much information here so that we actually get bogged down in it. When you have too much information here, the entire painting has the possibility of falling flat, simply because you are getting so involved in the minutiae that's unimportant that you lose the passion and the excitement that you had when you first saw the scene. Now, another thing to understand about this particular subject matter is the colors. We've got some beautiful colors happening. The reds, the yellows, oranges interact with each other. The little bit of the green, this is just absolutely gorgeous. As the sun hits the cyclist, this beautiful area of what I would consider to be like a phthalo blue, the repetition of like a phthalo blue here, repetition of the phthalo blue here, repetition there. These four areas of blue, they make the entire piece glow. They're the diamonds in the painting. So that's another area of the painting that I do need to recognize at this point when I'm thinking about what attracts me to it. So that essentially comes down to concept. So concept, we're looking at a street scene, but what is attracting us to the street scene? It's a cyclist, and what is attracting us even more to the cyclists is this beautiful harmony of colors that's happening over here. So when I'm dealing with the painting, I really want to make sure that I maintain cyclists and color at the forefront of my mind, so that when I'm building the context through suggestive brushstroke, I'm constantly trying to push forward how the color interacts with what essentially could be described as muddy areas. And in doing that, I should be able to push and pull, push and pull, push and pull the painting, so that as I'm developing the tapestry, the important parts of the painting remain true. But yeah, so I'm just looking at laying in some of the what we call directional brush strokes to give context. I can see straight away that the kind of purple that I chose is a little bit too purple, but it's part of the conversation that I want in the initial stages of this painting. So I'm not going to make any adjustments just yet, but I'm very aware that my purple is too purple. All right, so there's some of the landscape happening, and then obviously, like we said, we are actually painting the cyclist. So let's make some suggestion about the cyclist, the street poles. This is the side of the building, and then we've got the side over there. So because this is a little too green for my liking, I'm going to slip straight in with my brownish colors and start making some adjustments, allowing the visual mixing to happen on the canvas. And all the time that I'm laying in these brush strokes, as you can see, I'm not coloring in. I'm trying to do my best to allow my brush to describe what is happening on the canvas. So here is the gates of Chinatown. So opposed to actually drawing in the gates and coloring them in, I'm allowing the brush to do the work. I'm looking for those darker areas. So here we've got the undercutting of the cars. Also trying to understand how this brown is making a difference to what I thought was purple, but is obviously a little bit green. So adding in this more of a reddish kind of tone at this particular point is bringing it more towards the purple. And I'm just always trying to describe something about what I'm seeing. So I'm coming back to the cyclists over here, remembering I want to describe something of the cyclists. You can see how I'm using this tapestry style brush stroke to break over into itself. And in doing so, I'm darkening areas. So I'm just going to pull back a little bit, put in the next, what I assume is a traffic light over there. And then I've got this dark undercutting of the storefront. So I need to make some adjustments immediately in order to start pulling this into the area that I want it to go. So I'm actually going to slip in straight away with some of the yellows. The yellow that I put onto my palette was pure cadmium yellow deep, so I'm slipping just a little bit of titanium white into it, and we're going to say there's a traffic light, there's a traffic light. You can see the brush stroke has got this tapestry like effect to it. It's very light. I didn't squish my paint in, I laid my paint on top by changing the angle of my brush. I didn't go direct. I had a little bit of an angle going down, so the paint slid across the surface. This brings in some of the yellows that are important to me, and then I pay attention to, here are the arches of Chinatown. Okay, I want to start talking about the street, because that's one of the things about the background, is the background needs to be something that you're continuously building. That's the secret of working with your paint as though you're working in a tapestry, is that you're constantly building your background, the context. Because I'm enjoying this brownish yellow that I've got, I can also see over here there is a person crossing the road, so I'm going to slip that in. And then coming back to these cyclists, they actually have a yellow bike. So I'm going to slip the yellow bike in, and there's a bit of street furniture over there. I think it's railing, and thinking about those greens underneath the Chinatown arch. Coming back to mention something about this. Look how beautiful that is with the dry brush. I've lost a lot of the paint in my brush, and now I'm just looking to see if there's anywhere else I can make a suggestion, remembering that the context, you need to be constantly building. So I'm constantly looking to see where my eye catches the most recent color, which is this over here. And I think I could do some nice suggestion there. There's some buildings on the edges. And here I'm going to put a directional brush stroke through, simply to tie this into one plane. And we'll do a little bit of a suggestion over here. I'm aware that this area is empty, so I'm just going to slip that in over there. And as we develop this tapestry, we will be a little bit more refined as we go, but these directional brush strokes just make sure that the painting works as a whole. So here I'm very gently, as you can see, holding my brush quite far back so that the pressure is very soft when the bristles hit the canvas surface. I'm just laying down some of the blues, and the reason why I'm making these color decisions is because when we were looking at that original image, we were first attracted to the oranges, yellows, and the blues in the piece, and then using the greens more as a foil for them. So it's very important at this point to be making these color statements so that the painting doesn't go in a direction that you didn't intend. You can, of course, adjust as you work through the piece based on what the painting wants you to do and what the painting needs, what your intentions are. But for now, we're so early in the conversation that we're just starting the conversation, saying to the painting, this is where I'd like us to go. And as you can see, again, these are just very suggestive brush strokes. This is a building, we've got some floors, we've got the vertical structures. Again, looking at the side of the street over there, I'm aware that there's something that needs to happen in the sky, but I don't know what it is, so I'm not going to do anything. As I'm laying down these brush strokes as well, I'm really staring at the image so that I'm trying to be as accurate as I possibly can in where I lay down. They all have some kind of intention, but they don't say everything about what they're talking about. They only say something about what they're talking about. Where we're going to next is we do need to slip in some of the red, which was an immediate statement. I feel like it may be a little too early, but because the red is such a dominant aspect of this painting, I want to make my color choices make sense as we move through the piece. Here I finished a little too early, but that's not a problem. My brush is a little dirty, so I'm picking up a new fresh pot of paint and some of the scenes. Okay, so all we're going to be doing for the next little section is picking up areas in the painting that we can use what's on our brush to say something about. We're never going to over describe, and we're always going to be saying something about something as we're laying down the brush. So for example, here there's a Jack Chow insurance sign. I'm just going to put that down over there, and then, you know, my primary statement is usually in the area where I want the most dominant amount of information, and then I let my eye just float through the painting to see what other areas of color I can pick up. As I'm laying down these directional brush strokes, I'm slowly destroying any sense of structure. These are just kind of superficial statements, so I'm going to need to be coming back in and dealing with some of the structure of the actual piece, otherwise it just becomes a flat painting. So we've got the cyclist over there, the other cyclist is going to be there. So what I'm going to do is just, this is a slightly tinted titanium. As you can see, it's tinted with a little bit of what was on my brush, which was the red, and I'm very happy with that because I'm not quite ready to jump straight into white. And so at the moment I'm looking at things that are kind of white, but I'm also looking at developing structure. There's this lovely area behind the gates of Chinatown. You can see how I've laid down that brush stroke. I'm trying to discuss something about what's behind the gates themselves, but you see how it's a tapestry-like brushstroke. So this is where you allow the viewer to do a lot of the visual blending. And again, it's not the laborious blending that you would need to do if you had simply drawn and then we're now coloring in. So my brush is quite tinted, so I'm just going to use some of that for the windows in the side over there. I'm noticing here that on this light pole or street pole, it's got these like metal notices, I think. So I'm just popping in some of the metal notices. I do want us to be drawn towards a cyclist, so I'm just going to get a directional brush stroke moving across over there. The street light, the traffic light that I put in here is quite dominant. So I'm just going to say there is a little bit of light running down the side, and there's a little bit of light running up at the top over there. So that really does stand out very strongly, and I'm aware of it. I probably need to reload my actual titanium. So there's a bit of the streets coming down. Cyclists are approximately here. Back of a cyclist, arm of a cyclist. Then you've got the side of the building over here. Then there's this ledge of the building on this side. I'm going to slip back into grabbing some of my brick kind of a color, come back to talk about this. And the way that I make these decisions about where I'm going to next is really about what catches my eye next. And it's also evaluating what the colors are doing with each other on the canvas surface as I'm putting them down. So I've maintained the sense of the road. Okay, and we've got a little bit of the Chinatown arches. See how the Chinatown arches are steadily becoming more important. And as I'm painting them, I'm finding far more pleasure in painting them than I initially suspected. So that could be an indication that this painting may end up being more about the arches and less about the cyclists, but I still want to keep these cyclists developed as I go. So using the magic of video, we're doing a little bit of a fast motion here, and it looks a little crazy and chaotic, but you'll notice that I have slowed down some areas, like this area here, and that allows you the time to notice how specific these brushstrokes are. They don't just simply color in, they're trying to describe something about the forms that can be found in the subject itself. And because each brushstroke is being laid down with the intention of one brushstroke instead of two to describe the form that it's dealing with, each brushstroke has its own unique character. This helps to stop too much pattern developing in the painting, and as we know, pattern, when you have too much of it, it can actually lull your viewer into boredom, and it removes any motion and excitement from the painting. Obviously, too much pattern and you can build in too much chaos and also cause your viewer to disengage. But we'll handle that as we move through the piece. The nice thing is that at the moment, the pattern is within our control. And you'll notice here on these little orange slashes, just how carefully I'm laying them down, and they're there to try to describe everything they can about those little roofs on the arches. You'll also notice how the brush strokes are quite disrespectful to what is already on the canvas. They do use what is on the canvas as a clue to how they should lay themselves down, but they're disrespectful, and this also builds in a lovely thing of lots of soft edges. We all know that when we've got a painting built up of many hard edges, it's quite tough to understand how to soften the edges, and the soft edges are so important to allow our viewer to move through the piece and not get stuck in any one area. When you're painting like this, soft edges naturally occur, and then it's very easy to decide where you want a hard edge for the viewer to stop and spend some time. You'll also notice that I'm not scared about placing in some detail, because I know that those details, although they get destroyed, they will return. And I'm always coming back to my initial concept, which was dealing with the colors. So look here how I'm going to be laying in a nice dash of yellow. There it is. Just to reestablish what my concept was, and I'm not scared of placing in things like the overhead wires at this point, even though I know that they will be destroyed, because they form part of the underlying conversation that is in the painting. And they may be there in the end, and they may not, but it means that I won't have to laboriously superimpose the cables over the top when the painting's finished. It's part of the painting itself. So a quick assessment of where we are. So yes, the cyclist I'm continuing to maintain as I've been breaking down through the brushwork, this very suggestive brushwork. I've also been trying to build up these cyclists without destroying the unity in the work. So that's where you'll see there's brush strokes that go through, but there's also brush strokes which are starting to try to define what's happening with the cyclist. And obviously none of these brush strokes are precious. That's a nice thing about painting this way. Using suggestive brush strokes, I'm not over investing my time so that I'm scared about destroying something, and I'm also building my confidence that even though I destroy something, I'll be able to bring it back. I'm also identifying areas that I find particularly interesting, trying to learn from. So for example, the way this little bit of pink sits against the orangey kind of colors here, and you can see there's a slight dash of purple that's crept in on the side, and then it does really add to the impression of reflected light against this light pole. It's happening again here where this white was slightly tinged with a purpley kind of a tone against that very strong alizarin crimson, and again it's got the nice feeling of light that is reflecting off the pole. So this is something that I'm learning from, and although I'd like to keep it, I'm also aware that I'm not being precious. So it may go, but because I've learned, I know how to go about re-establishing it. And I can see how using green in here is really making these areas sparkle and bringing in a sense of light. So again, something I'd like to keep, but not necessarily just that. I'm also learning from. So if these areas go away, I also know that one of my secret colors in this particular palette that I'm using on this painting is the green. As you can see through the suggestive brushwork, we've already got a lovely suggestion of the street. The area that I told you was context. I've been steadily building this as I've been working. So it's a mishmash of strokes, but for the viewer, being attracted to these stronger areas that I've been establishing, and these areas where you can really understand the reflected light, their brain is then supplying all the information that they need to understand this is the context. So they know, being on a street, this is probably a building. And I don't really need to do more than that, than just give them suggestions so that their mind can do the rest. Same thing's happening with the suggestion of the building over here. I want to keep establishing the cyclists, keep working with establishing the reds, the blues, and the yellows. And also what I'd really like to do is to get more of a sense of space happening in the painting. So moving forward, the first thing I know to do today is to start potentially with the lighter areas. I'm going to come in with something quite brutal like a white. The painting's still wet, so it's going to be picking up a lot of the color that's already on the canvas. Remembering that there's 3 areas where you can mix your colors. You can mix them on your palette, you mix them when you pick up the paint off the palette, and you mix them when you apply the paint to the surface. So I'm very aware of those 3 areas. I'm going to be wiping my brush regularly, potentially doing only 3 strokes and then wiping based on how the brush strokes are interacting with the painting surface. And this is where these kind of brush strokes, which break over each other, have a little bit of a tapestry-like effect, are very important. So going forward, first thing to do, start trying to establish some more atmospheric light. Just start with white, and see where we go and start making my decisions from there. Because this way of painting, being suggestive, you're really relying on how the paint looks once it's in relationship with your canvas surface, and then you make a decision as to where to go next, as opposed to sitting down, drawing it all out, making all your decisions before, and being so precious about the decisions that you're making and the care that you're putting into developing the painting that you're too scared to make adjustments as you go. This way of painting is about relationship with the painting, and also relationship with your viewer. And it's that relationship with the viewer that I think that we often forget when we're working as painters, because we get so wrapped up in our subject, especially when we're dealing with complicated subjects as we are here, a street scene where there's a lot going on. And we also get so wrapped up in our materials themselves that we forget that the painting only really comes to life once the viewer starts engaging with the piece. You'll notice that very sexy little bit of brushstroke there. That's a very successful brushstroke in terms of one brushstroke instead of two to describe something. It gives us so much information about the light that's on that little roof of the arch. And one of the things people often feel a little confused about when they're painting in this way is when to start reducing those big, heavy, broad brush strokes. And that really is a personal preference in terms of how close to representational you want to bring this piece, remembering that the representational aspect of it is only achieved in the viewer's eye, not by the tightness on the canvas. We're still working with those brush strokes which are acting like stitches in a tapestry. But you'll notice here that I'm not using so many of those big broad brush strokes anymore. I'm not scared of them, and I'm happy to bring them in if there's a section where I'm first of all feeling a little confused as to how to handle it and I need to make a big bold move. I may lay down a large brush stroke just to break down some of what's there and to see if there's something new that can start a new conversation and to help me bring up with some new solutions. And I'll also do it to unify areas in a little bit of a softer manner. But really at this point, I'm starting to handle my brush stroke with a lot more delicacy. You'll also see that I'm loading the brush a lot less as well. So on these brush strokes, I'll pick up some pure pigment, I'll lay it down with some intention on the area where I want to make my primary statement. But then I'm also allowing the brush to move its way through the canvas, picking up areas where I can have a little bit of that color, but a bit more of a subtle use of that color, because again, working with oils, the canvas surface itself is still wet. So every time I lay down a brush stroke, I'm picking up something of what is already on the canvas, which adds a nice tint to the color that's on my brush. And I use that. I use that by then placing it in other areas of the painting in order to describe something of that area, but with a more subtle blended color. But the key thing that I want you to pay attention to here is just how delicate my brushwork is. I'm looking at nurturing out all those little details. A lot of the stuff is already there for me because I've been working so loosely and with my brushstroke being very suggestive. So a lot of the work is already there for me, and now my job is simply to bring it to completion, to look for those little elements that will help the viewer understand what it is that I'm suggesting, so that they can imagine the scene for themselves and engage with the scene. Little brush strokes here and there just to nurture out the subject, giving the viewer just enough so that the entire thing is not described, but there is enough of the important elements of that subject for the viewer to engage with the scene, building on that idea of relationship. You know, I could keep working on the piece really slowly with a smaller, finer focus on the brushwork to really bring out the details in the piece. And that's what I mean by developing the tapestry in the painting. Extending the period of working and really starting to develop a higher level of sophistication in terms of how you respond to the piece, and spending less time destroying, more time building and defining the things that bring you closer to your concept. And as you work through that process, you work closer and closer towards something far more realistic and representational. However, that's not where I personally find my aesthetic to be grounded. My aesthetic is more grounded in this kind of painting, where you have these lovely loose brush strokes, the little painterly brushstrokes that are still visible in the piece. And what I enjoy most about leaving the piece at this particular point is that when you stand back, the entire painting becomes a whole, and the viewer really engages their imagination, and it becomes very realistic from a distance. But when you're at this space where you are now, you can still see the painterly brushstrokes. The viewer gets to indulge in what it is to understand a painting as a painter, as opposed to just experiencing the painter as a viewer. The whole painting is developed through very gestural, suggestive brushwork. A perfect example of that is this pole in the front. We go from purples into stronger kind of alizarin crimson, still a dash of purple on the side there, which has got a bit of quinacridone. This just simply white and quinacridone, a nice green, a little slither of orange on the side. You can see how at some points you get quite lost, but then if you keep an eye on your end point, you've set your compass at the beginning, you know what your concept is. In this particular piece was those colors. It was the oranges, the blues, the greens, the yellows, and then it was also the cyclist. So you can see successfully there is a nice suggestion of the cyclist. They're pretty strong in the painting, especially with the helmet. You noticed how much time I spent developing the helmet, not only by actually painting the helmet, but by painting the areas that went around the helmet to bring definition into it, and how I paid homage to the greens, which we noticed when we started painting today. We're really creating a beautiful foil for those main colors to sparkle. So in terms of my actual final concept, I feel I've achieved it. Cyclists, this is really not defined at all. It's the context, which is the street. So we've got the colors, the cyclists, and the context. There's not much more that I want the viewer to understand about the piece. So that's it. Thank you.